Good afternoon. I'm Alejandro Werner, the director of Georgetown Americas Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Zoom seminar on the Summit of the Americas, the role of business in building sustainable, resilient, and equitable future in the hemisphere. Today, in advance of the ninth Summit of the Americas in June 2022, the Georgetown Americas Institute is convening a group of private sector leaders to provide perspectives on ways to address hemispheric challenges and opportunities while promoting cooperation towards region-wide inclusive economic growth and prosperity. The panelists will discuss private sector recommendations for renewing public-private partnerships that reflect the 2022 summit focus on building sustainable, resilient, and equitable future. We have a great panel. First, Sarah Thorne is a Senior Director for Global Government Affairs at Walmart Stores Inc. Company. Sarah is primarily responsible for managing international policy issues at Walmart. In this capacity, she advocates for Walmart's priorities in legislation and trade negotiations that impact the company's worldwide sourcing, e-commerce, and retail distribution rights. She also leads a team that manages global supply chain policies, including responsible sourcing and labor issues. In 2011, Thorne led the strategy team that developed Walmart's Global Women's Economic Empowerment Initiative, and she remains actively involved in that initiative. She was also a Presidential Management Fellow at the U.S. Information Agency. She worked at PricewaterhouseCoopers and AMP Incorporated. She holds a Master of Arts degree from Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy and a Bachelor of Arts degree in Comparative Area Studies and Comparative Literature from Duke University. Rodrigo Sanchez Mujica serves as Regulatory Counsel for Latin America at Stripe. Previously, he spent 2 years as Regulatory and Legal Strategy Manager at Mercado Libre. He also worked for 11 years at the Central Bank of Mexico, overseeing financial regulation and payment systems, where he participated, among other projects, in crafting Mexico's fintech law. Since 2011, he teaches courses on fintech and financial innovation at Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México, holds a bachelor degree in law from ITAM and an LLM from the Benjamin Cardoso School of Law. Steven Dipes is a Vice President of Global Strategy and Analysis at AdvaMed. He currently serves as co-chair of the Americas Business Dialogues Transparency and Regulatory Working Group, as well as the project lead for the COVID-19 Medical Device Regulatory Convergence Project, Standards Alliance 2.0. Prior to joining AdvaMed, he served as Executive Director for the American Chamber of Commerce in Rio de Janeiro. He has also served as Senior Advisor for the Albright Stonebridge Group in Brazil, working on global businesses and government relations, and as the Executive Director of the Brazil-US Business Council. He began his career at the American National Standards Institute. He graduated with a bachelor's degree in electrical engineer from Purdue University. He also holds a certificate from Georgetown University in nonprofit executive management. Finally, Alma Caballero, who will moderate today's discussion, is a senior advisor to the Georgetown Americas Institute and a member of Georgetown University School of Foreign Service Board of Advisors. She currently serves as regional director at McClarty Associates, a global geopolitical advisory firm in Washington, D.C. She earned a BS in Science, Technology, and International Affairs and an MA in Latin American Studies from Georgetown University. Alma, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alejandro, and thank you very much to our panelists who have been key contributors, not only in the months leading up to the Summit of the Americas, but for over many, many years in providing recommendations to governments and providing a key role in convening opportunities such as this one to showcase the role of business leading up to the summit and in the Summit of the Americas. As Alejandro mentioned, the 9th Summit of the Americas will be happening early June in Los Angeles. This is the first time ever since the Miami 1994 summit, which was the first summit of the Americas under the Clinton administration, takes place in the US. And given that this is the only hemispheric encounter and meeting of leaders from the hemisphere, we are very interested and grateful for our participants to provide the business standpoint of what the goal of the summit is. So I'll start with Sarah so that she can share with us what is the business standpoint in achieving and what does your focus mean on building a sustainable, resilient, and equitable future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alma, and thank you, Alejandro, for the nice introduction. So, it's interesting when we saw the title of building, a sustainable, resilient, and equitable future. In some ways, that's kind of how we describe our own business operations. Those are the things, that's the kind of business we want to be, a sustainable and resilient and inclusive business. And so what I just thought I'd just ground everybody a little bit with like, who is Walmart in the Americas and what do we care for? And then tell you a little bit about what we hope to see both in the summit, but also ongoing from governments in the Americas. So many of you know Walmart, but you may not know of our presence outside the United States and in the Americas. And it's interesting, we have almost as many units of outside of the United States in the Americas as we do in the United States. So we have about 4,000 units. And when I say units, that means clubs, stores, discount stores, bodegas, lots of different formats. But about 4,000 in our retail operations in Mexico, Central America, and Chile altogether. And that accounts for about 276,000 employees in those markets. And in addition, we have a very strong and growing sourcing operation. And if you think about the kinds of products that we're bringing in from Peru and Ecuador and Colombia and all of those retail markets, it's produce and it's apparel, but it's also higher end products like electronics and auto parts and things like that. And essentially, I would say, in addition, right now, the Americas is becoming an even more important strategic partner for us in terms of sourcing as we think about looking at resilience and making sure we have alternatives for sourcing so that you're not so geo-dependent on one country. You have lots of different alternatives. So we're really thinking about how we strengthen those sourcing operations. And the last thing I'll say about our operations is, we're increasingly omni-channel. So it's not just those stores and clubs. It's really about how we reach our customers through electronic means, meaning traditional e-commerce, but also leveraging those stores and clubs as distribution points. So how are we actually letting the Walmart mom choose how she wants to get her products? Does she want to shop online and come to the store? Do you want it delivered to you? Do you want it delivered in 5 minutes? Do you want to pick it up from a tower? Lots of opportunities, and that segment of our business is growing incredibly quickly and has accelerated certainly during the pandemic. And we're doing a lot of things in the markets to help our customers be able to take advantage of the digital economy. So things like helping with digital wallets and helping with making sure people have access to broadband, because if you can't actually have access to the internet, it's really hard to participate in the digital economy. So I say all that to say, we have a really strong presence in the Americas. It was our first, Mexico was our first overseas expansion, and it's really our home. And when I say we want to be a sustainable and resilient and inclusive company, we really do. We think of our stores and our clubs and our associates as part of the community. We think retail is an incredible first entryway into a formal economy. I started my career in retail. I worked at Burger King, but a lot of people do. And it's a great way to have an entry point to understand what does it mean to show up for a job? What does it mean to make sure you have customer service? All of those soft skills that are so important, but it's also a really important place to grow. So we take an enormous amount of our management from those frontline workers. We give them training, we give them opportunity, and we bring people into our stores from the informal economy. Similarly, with our suppliers, we're thinking about how we can grow inclusively. So how do we bring small and medium enterprises? How do we bring smallholder farmers into our ecosystem? And what kind of capacity and training do they need to be part of our full ecosystem. And then, how are we a more sustainable company? What are we doing with renewable energy? How are we thinking about waste and circularity? How are we leveraging the business to become a more regenerative company, meaning not only just protecting, but also really helping to regenerate the planet, certainly focusing very much on oceans and forests. So those are that's the kind of company we are, that's the company we want to continue to be. So how do you do that in the Americas? Well, it's dead boring, but companies need predictability. Companies need strong rule of law, and they need to understand how to have a business operations that have certainty, continuity. We need environments where we can have predictable growth. And we also need a healthy and well-educated workforce. And this is not rocket science. I think we all know what needs to happen to promote investment and to have growth. And so when we look at the Summit of the Americas, we're thinking about, okay, we know what we need to do. What are the kinds of things that we can think about promoting to make sure we can get to that predictable certainty and productive growth environment? And I'm happy to talk, I don't want to talk everything now, but I'm happy to talk about more specific recommendations, really learning from the pandemic about how digital inclusion, digitization can actually get us to the right place in terms of rule of law and inclusive growth.
Sarah, thank you. Thank you so much. Indeed, we'll have a couple of questions alluding to what you just finished your remarks on, which is this is the first time since the Summit of the Americas that we're going to be holding it amid a pandemic. So it would be fascinating also to get your sense of what should be those kind of recommendations specifically, given the current context that we're experiencing. But before doing that, I would very much like to invite now Rodrigo from Stripe. Walmart, like Sarah mentioned, is a company that many people are familiar with, that many of us have been to. But Stripe is a new company, a company that perhaps all of us are using, but we don't know that we're using Stripe. So Rodrigo, the floor is yours now to also provide us with a sense from the business standpoint that you're in, which is fintech, what this Summit of the Americas means to Stripe, and what does building a sustainable, resilient, and equitable future mean from where you're sitting in now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alma, Georgetown Americas Institute, and Alejandro for having us here. I think it's an amazing forum to discuss exactly some of the topics and trends that Sarah was already highlighting. No, I think it's a unique opportunity we have in our hands. So for us, the framing of the topic means a clear opportunity to focus on Stripe's mission. If you don't know us, Stripe's focus or mission is to grow the GDP of the internet. And that allows us, particularly in the circumstances or in the moment that we're living, to have a laser focus on creating robust ecosystem that offers trust, reliability, and scalable solutions for the internet economy to continue to grow. No, predictability, clearly something that we flourish now, or we need, and we are always pursuing. No, one of our goals in Stripe is to help existing economic activity to migrate to the internet and to enable completely new undertakings that could never happen in the offline world. That's the type of services, ventures, and new business models that we're seeing, and that we're allowing them to grow and to reach the internet and basically the whole world. No, for us in Stripe in LATAM in particular, this translates as a focus in helping SMEs. As we all know, 42% of the GDP in the region comes from SMEs. 30% of all employments come from SMEs. But not only that, personal ventures and entrepreneurs need the technology that we're building, the infrastructure platform that their business needs to succeed, and especially to be productive. And at the same time, what we're trying to figure out and help is how to reduce some of the friction of doing business online. No, today, 89% of our businesses, or the businesses that use Stripe, are SMEs in LATAM. So that's a huge impact that we're seeing, and a reality check for us that we need to continue to tailor, build, and design products for those needs. When we often say at Stripe, and you've probably seen some of the discourse and policy briefings, that the global internet economy is in its early days. And when we say that, it sounds trite, but everything we're seeing gives us confidence that it's true. Only 12% of online spending last year was through the internet. In LATAM specifically, in Mexico, more in particular, we're seeing that retail spend was 11.3% of all retail spending. That's a 27% year-over-year growth, which is one of the largest in the world. To be exact, the stats we're citing, this is the biggest growth in the world next to India, but it's only 12% of the total economy. So there's still a lot of room to grow. And resilience in that sense for us, and we have one of our guiding principles or operating principles, is to have a user first mentality. And that is, we're gonna continue to design and offer products to help relieve internet and global e-commerce pains, ranging from card acceptance to capital and to technical analytical solutions. Now, fraud in the region, it's one of the main pains, and we're trying to incorporate artificial intelligence and machine learning programs and softwares to enable and to foster trust in a very new economic sector. Now, just to give you some numbers of why we think resilience and an extra focus is needed. Last year alone, the collective business process in Stripe was $640 billion US. That was 60% upgrade or growth from the previous years. This reflects how and why the pandemic meant to online businesses. No, 1,400 new companies joined Stripe every day last year, and just in Latin America, we grew 518% just during the course of the pandemic. So that's some of the reasons to be extra focused and to continue building and having users first mentality. And just one thing that it's my favorite, and I have to say it because I think it comes perfectly to the sustainability part of the focus of this year's agenda, and where we see a huge opportunity also to bring creativity and innovation, is how do we fight climate change and inclusion? Now, 28% of the companies that incorporate in Stripe are identified as having a minority founder, and 43% of them are first-time entrepreneurs. And in the climate change efforts, we have two products. One is called Stripe Climate that I invite everyone to look into, because it's a great opportunity that we found the need of users to participate in the need to change climate tendencies, but they didn't know how. So we created a tool that enabled them to direct a portion of their income into carbon removal exercises and technologies. Furthermore, we created a fund, an advanced market commitment of $925 million alongside Alphabet, Shopify, Meta, and McKinsey, which is basically creating the incentives for researchers, entrepreneurs, and investors that there's going to be a market for carbon removal purchasing in the market. No, so these are just a few ideas, and would love to continue talking and exploring with you guys. Thank you, Alma.
Thank you, Rodrigo. That's fascinating, and thank you for putting the context and the stats behind also the impact that COVID led to the entrance of this SMEs into the digital market. So that's wonderful to hear, and very much look forward to exploring potential ways and how to elevate this during this summit that brings together the leaders, but also civil society and entrepreneurs also from the region together. Stephen, over to you. What does this mean also from the perspective of where you now sit? And also talk about the leadership that you've done through the ABD as co-chairing the Transparency Initiative working group as well. And also, it would be fantastic to hear, just given the industry that you represent, what Sarah and Rodrigo briefly discussed on the COVID implications to this, and given that we're undergoing still the pandemic, and it's not over yet, and it won't be over yet in the near future, unfortunately. What are some of the recommendations and lessons learned, and how should we use this summit to also elevate those set of recommendations to the leaders of the region? So thank you very much, Stephen.
Thank you, Alma, and thank you, Alejandro, for the invitation, and Carolina for the outreach, and the Americas Institute for the invitation. As you noted, I wear several hats, and I think the one most pertinent to the work we're doing with the summit is on the Americas Business Dialogue, Transparency and Regulatory Working Group with my colleague from Walmart, Welby Lehman, and Oscar, also from Peru, kind of covering the different aspects. But my paying day job is with the Advanced Medical Technology Association and the Medical Technologies Industries, which is not pharmaceuticals, but it's essentially all of the products that you might see at a hospital or point of care clinic that are not the drugs. So anything from diagnostics to implants to pacemakers to Band-Aids to 3D printers of replacement human tissues, and probably most highlighted in the media over the past 2 years on the front lines in combating and recovering from COVID-19. So gloves and needles and syringes and all of the med tech on the front line. So we've been working across the different working groups of the ABD and with the Inter-American Development Bank, and trying to align our work so that it has some coherence, very much in line with what the summit leaders are hoping to achieve on their triennial meeting. You've got the four main pillars of this 9th summit: democracy and governance, pandemic and disaster preparedness, equitable and green economic recovery, and digitization to grow the middle class. And really our work has been focusing on those first two, democracy and governance, under which you have topics such as transparency and good regulatory practices. But also in our pandemic and disaster preparedness, we have really an overlap of the work and a convergence, I would say, of not just the transparency and regulatory work, but also of the America's Business Dialogue Health Working Group, of which we were a founding member during COVID. And as the region continues to recover from COVID, we really see a unique opportunity to create the resilience in our region's health economies and health ecosystems, in addition to addressing the current pandemic. This does take a rethinking, we believe, of our approach to health economies and ecosystems, including supply chains, regulatory issues, digital health, financing, and other topics. And we believe that the ambitions under the 4 summit pillars require the governments to have an ongoing institutionalized collaboration with the private sector and civil society, including on health. This collaboration on the health front currently does not exist in the hemispheric fashion. So as a member of the ABD across these different working groups, we've been working with our private and public sector colleagues over the past year to develop key policy recommendations to share with the heads of state participating in the summit in the Americas. And maybe I don't want to get into the details now because I know we have a conversation to unfold, but just kind of recognizing that we have barriers to health and barriers to trade, and they're not mutually exclusive. There's a relationship between the two. And we want to change the view that addressing the trade barriers is somehow zero sum with addressing the health issues. And we saw this acutely in terms of supply chains and value chains in the medical technology sector, where you've got outdated technical regulations that constituted non-tariff barriers to trade, but that also constituted health barriers and barriers of patients and those suffering from COVID and getting the med tech that they needed. At the last summit in Lima, we highlighted kind of the leading role in the relationship between good regulatory practices and transparency and regional economic growth, and this was pre-COVID. We've made significant progress, and I would say have significant private sector contributions to the efforts to highlight that we'll talk about, including since the last summit, we created and launched with our partners in the region the Inter-American Coalition for Regulatory Convergence and Business Ethics in the Medical Technology Sector, two separate coalitions addressing both the transparency and regulatory aspects. But maybe to put some numbers to help put it in context, 5, 10, 20, and 30, and some of you may have heard these numbers before, but in the old school, we know that we're in a different world of trade than where we were in the past. And we really do need to have a close look at a more resilient supply chains and value chains. And part of that conversation is an increased diversity in the footprint of manufacturing, including for MedTech. But we would say, but a lot of governments are kind of jumping to the end and say, we need more local production, which we welcome. But if you make a ranking of the biggest barriers to health and trade in the region, that's not the biggest barrier. The biggest barrier has been regulatory, just having a coherent whole of government set of good regulatory practices. And so we have these numbers, 5, 10, 20, 30. Average global tariffs around the world are 5%. And that's true in the Americas as well. But the customs inefficiencies are equivalent to a 10% import tariff, and regulatory non-alignments are equivalent to a 20% import tariff. And the lack of ethical business conduct can bring costs equivalent to between a 10 and 30% import tariff. So we've welcomed the efforts of the government since the last summit to make pragmatic gains in bringing trade tools to help address these non-tariff barriers that have a real significant impact on regional economic growth and integration, on trade, and also on health. And as the conversation goes, we'll be happy to talk about some of our specific proposals. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. That's great framework. And taking what Stephen just mentioned, Sarah, on the 5, 10, 20 and the existing inhibitors, for business, not only locally, but multinational companies like Walmart to enter into these markets to seek greater impact and presence in the markets. What are some of the concrete actions that and policy recommendations that you recommend and that can enable this increased investment, innovation, productivity, and that can foster that sustained economic growth in the region, given this, existing context?
I think you'll see a striking commonality among all of the panelists as we think through some of these issues, and I was struck as Stephen was talking, one of the things that we hear over and over and over again are that, supply chains were brittle and fragile, when in our experience during the pandemic, yes, we had, an extraordinary event when essentially all the countries around the world sort of shut down at the same time. So I'm not sure what systems would have been as resilient and agile to make sure that, everything broke at once and we're going to be fine. What we did see, in fact, though, was that our supply chains actually rebounded pretty quickly, and we're very innovative in thinking about, and particularly in the Americas as well, okay, we have these problems, how are we going to solve them? And I think that the lesson for us around the pandemic was when we work together, we can do really good things. And I'll give you an example. We got a call from the government and said, we're running out of isolate gowns, the gowns that you put on to protect people, in hospitals and caregiving settings. And in fact, the emails I saw were pretty dire about, 2 days, 3 days left. And so we activated we'd never sourced these before, ever, but we activated our supplier network, and we actually got incredible innovation out of the supplier network to the point that we used to only do, onesies, right? Take it on their disposable. We actually had a supplier figure out, wait a minute, I can reconfigure my factory. I can make isolate gowns with a coating on them that can be washed and be reusable. And we could import them and help fill those, those deficient supplies. And the reason we were able to do, one, the FDA had emergency authorizations, right? So you could actually move that regulatory process quicker. But two, we saw just incredible facilitation with Customs and Border Protection. And that's the kind of thing we need to see, not when we're in a crisis, but sort of all the time. And so one of the areas that we're pushing really hard on is digitization. There's just, in this day and age, is absolutely no reason that we're pushing paper. It's inefficient, it leads to corruption, and it's costly. It slows things down, and I'll give you another example. What we saw, because we didn't have as many people sitting and being able to push the paper, we had to digitize a lot of our processes and certifications. So one of the areas that we just saw leaps and bounds in were phytosanitary certifications, those things that have to go with your fruit and veg to make sure that you have the right certifications from the origin to the receipt. Now, there's a global system that everybody is linking into, but a pretty simple solution was like, how about we just make it a PDF and we send it? That's not hard for countries to do. Customs was accepting PDFs of ePhyto certifications, and think about it. If you need to make a change, if they find an inconsistency, how much easier to do it electronically than like, oh, it's going to take me 3 days to go back and check. And meanwhile, your stuff is sitting in a hot port somewhere. So that's what we want to see. We want to see much more rapid adoption of digitization, certainly for the supply chain side of things, but also for the rule of law issues. We were talking to a small supplier the other day, and I talked to you about, we do a lot to try to bring smaller producers in to be part of the formal economy. So we do tons of capacity building, we do outreach, we do training, we have programs when our merchants will adopt a PMA and they'll teach them directly, here's how you become a supplier of Walmart. But that's very direct. If we can actually think about what are the ways we make the regulatory and the permitting and the tax environment and the procurement environment digitized, that helps everybody. And it helps those smaller guys even more because they don't have to wait, like we talked to the supplier, 2 years for their environmental permit. If you're waiting 2 years for an environmental permit, it's going to be that much harder for you to get your business up and running. So these are the kinds of things in the recommendations that our colleagues, and I know Steve is like, wow, she learned Wellbe's talking points, but it's true because these are the kinds of things that make absolute common sense. They're things that we saw very transparently during the pandemic when people had to rush and come up with solutions. We shouldn't backslide. There's absolutely no reason to go backwards. We need to sort of take this as these were good practices. We absolutely have to go forward because it'll help with rule of law, but it also help with those supply chains. And if we're going to talk about nearshoring, if we're going to talk about friendshoring, we actually have to talk about that other word, which is trade. So, how are we lifting up? We have lots of bilateral agreements with our trading partners, but these are fairly old agreements with the exception of the USMCA. What are we doing to say, okay, we have a lot of digital tools, we have a lot of new best practices here in digital trade. Why aren't we lifting up all of the other economies and markets in the Americas to say, can you guys help us do this too? So, we're actually thinking, how come there's really an economic framework for the Americas and isn't trade and investment a part of this? There's just so much opportunity to lock in some of these gains.
Excellent. Thank you, Sarah, for that. Stephen, I'll turn it over to you, just given that I suspect there will be some overlap to what Sarah just mentioned and the work that you've been doing also through the same working group. So any complementary policy recommendations in addition to those that Sarah just mentioned on how to address that 5-10-20 that you were speaking about. And also I just want to make sure to encourage the audience members to send any questions that they might have through the Q&A box, and I'll make sure to weave them into the conversation that we're having. So Stephen, over to you.
Thank you. And I would say complementary messages that build off of one another. And it's been very nice working over the years with Sarah and Wellbe and the Walmart team and the other colleagues on the ABD working groups. Maybe an example that ties to what she was talking about, digital, but also within the health and the med tech space. And then that as a nice segue into our recommendation. So during COVID, the regulatory authority, in order for you to get a device, a new device on the market, you have to go through the regulatory approvals process. And under COVID, everyone was sent home. And because in the case of Mexico, the processes are still paper-based, as they are in many places still, those dossiers sat on the desks in the empty offices. And also it was restricted and prohibited to even do remote review, even remote phone calls. So when there were increasing pushes for, say, a nationalized ventilator company, a number of questions jump up. One, you can have a nationalized ventilator company, but it doesn't solve the problem of where the parts come from. Two, you can have the best, if you can somehow magically fix that supply chain problem and have access to the components all the way down to the bottom, the products, the medtech, the life-saving medtech will just stack up on the dock because you can't get the regulatory approvals to get it to the patients. So I'd say as part of the conversation on how to make value chains more resilient and how to improve trade and health in the region, and part of the reason you need this public-private dialogue is to address these types of things that are not obvious. And you, again, building out a broader base of manufacturing is welcome, but before we do that, we need to really tackle the regulatory challenges. So we have a couple of specific recommendations in the medtech space, in the health space, but then also that apply to everyone. So our number one recommendation from the Health Working Group is that the governments establish an America's Rise Forum, an annual high-level multi-sectoral public-private health and economic forum in the Americas, which does not exist today, to really tackle these problems that can only be solved through a collaboration between the public and private sectors. We work quite a bit with the World Health Organization and the Pan American Health Organization, and they have recognized that the response that we had during COVID, even with its challenges, would have been far worse. It was much better, and it would have been impossible to achieve the results that we did with without the collaboration, public and private. So we note that the health ministries cannot rebuild health ecosystems and economies alone. The Pan American Health Organization cannot do it alone, but this institutionalized annual mechanism can incorporate the necessary perspectives and partners needed to do the hard work of transforming our region's economies, health economies and ecosystems. And with respect to health, we need all stakeholders consistently at the table to realize a sustainable, resilient, and equitable future in our hemisphere. I would say in addition to the health ministries, we encourage also the trade ministries, the digital ministries, the commerce ministries, as well as the private sector and civil society leaders to participate in such an annual forum. And that's kind of focused on the health and econ side. On what I'd say more the trade and good governance and rule of law side is having the governments leverage the opportunity of meeting in the summit to agree to some ambition on implementing foundational good regulatory practices. We've been pushing on this since the last summit. We've been working closely with the US host government and the other governments, and, you know, fingers crossed, rain dance, little prayer. We're hopeful that the summit will not go by without there being some type of advance in this area. We think it would be a tremendous lost opportunity if they did not do so. And to the extent that they can have some type of agreement and ambition, let's say, you know, implement GRP by 2025 by a coalition of willing economies, we as private sector actors on the ABD can continue our work with the bank, with the governments on what specifically that means. It's not just with the MedTech line agencies, it's with the central regulatory coordination bodies, you know, the counterparts to OIRA in the United States, CONAMER in Mexico, DNP in Colombia, SEAI in Brazil. I think many of these governments have been forward-leaning and made commitments on GRP, but I think the summit and the trade ministers from the top level really putting some spotlight on it can enable them and us working together so that by the time of the next summit, we can really look back and have some proud achievements that both helped on the trade side as well as the health side as well.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you. And the goal of this conversation is for us to also start sharing those recommendations and not wait until LA. So that people and the various stakeholders from the region, but also in DC and elsewhere, can start thinking about that as they get ready to travel to Los Angeles in June. So thank you for that. Rodrigo, what's your take? What are the action and concrete policy recommendations that from STRIPE and the overarching financial services working group that I know that you also were a huge part of recommend so that there is a business environment the hemisphere that is conducive for greater investment and innovation and productivity that can be elevated in June?
I think that the impact is clear, no? And the numbers I recently shared make it clear that from a positive perspective of digitalization, this is a unique opportunity that financial services and governments have to take advantage and see that the clear path forward is to maximize internet and technological solutions to further reach the goals that they're trying to meet. No, in Mexico, but this is a trend that we saw all over LATAM. There was a 10-year-fold advancement, or a leap forward, like we like to say, in the digitalization and adoption of digital channels to make the most common services and purchases and banking services throughout cell phones. No, everyone in LATAM has a cell phone. No, just to give you numbers, in Mexico, 81 million people have access to the internet. Not 75% of the population have a smartphone. A smartphone for fintechs is a channel, is a distribution mechanism, is an access, is a productivity tool that it's unique. So what are we seeing in the fintech side? And the IDB just published a study recently saying that in LATAM from 2018 to now, it grew 112%. $1.6 billion just in 2021 were invested. This is super positive news for a region that usually doesn't get a lot of good news. No, so our recommendation to the governments and to the summit is clear. We need to find a way, and Stripe has it very clearly embedded, that we need to be very responsible companies and assume a more active role and become partners and converge with policymakers in common goals. We're seeing financial inclusion, we're seeing formality, we're seeing tax inclusiveness, sustainability goals being exactly the same as those that are being pursued by governments. But the recommendation, to be concrete, needs to start with standardization and of regulatory frameworks in order for companies like Stripe or other global financial companies to enter the region. We need to make this simpler for us to passport and to migrate our businesses to different jurisdictions. And that might sound hard or utopical, no? But I think it's something that we can see the benefits across jurisdictions, but we can see the burdens of not having common principles or best practices established that enable us to quicker or more nimbler movement between, or fluid business movement across jurisdictions. No, we've seen good efforts and nice proposals from, for example, in Europe, it has been very successful, their passporting licenses scheme, where if you're licensed in one jurisdiction, you can operate in basically all of them. No, the IDB, the Pacific Alliance, the US-Mexico high-level dialogue are all examples of, let's put things concrete, not broad goals, but simple concrete goals and pillars that enable these goals, these policy goals, to actually get executed and for more business to come to the region. Actually, we were super happy to hear and listen to the minister, the secretary de la O participation with Alejandro a couple of weeks back, and saying that fintech was at the realm of their policy objectives and how they see that fintech and technology can be an enabler of credit underwriting and some of the productivity issues that are lacking in most of our regions. No, so we hope to continue pushing forums like the IDB and others to have concrete benefits and actionable plans.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo, and also thank you for following what the Institute is doing over the last couple of months and what's to come in the months ahead on that front. So thank you. So we've spoken about what the summit means. We've spoken about the policy that you hope to be reflected in the agreements reached in June. So how do we hold governments accountable, but also business accountable, and the various stakeholders that partake in this forum? Because we can be here discussing about the ideas and practical policies and tweaks that can be done that will enhance a much more competitive hemisphere and bring much more investment and make it an attractive place for innovation to take place. But how do we hold ourselves as businesses and also governments accountable to the agreements reached in LA? So I'll start with Sarah and then turn it over to Rodrigo and then ask Stephen for your views as well. Thank you.
So, I think part of it is about how do you have that continuous dialogue between businesses and governments. One of the areas that we've been really engaged in has been APEC over the years. And, APEC has grown up over time to create really good mechanisms for that public-private cooperation, whether it's through the ABAC process, where you have continual dialogues, but you have a framework, which is how do we create better economic integration? And I think that's where, with the maturity of the ABD process, what we don't want to see is like we have a summit and then we all go home for 3 years and we come back. How are we continuing? Okay, we have these recommendations. Where are the working groups behind the recommendations? How are we how are we using groups like yours to put information out there? A lot of the work that we've done in the past is, what are the right data sets? What's the right, what are the right, how are we taking all of the best practices from the business community and sharing them with governments so that we understand if we're looking at, for an example, best practices in environmental sustainability, well, what are we doing? Or if we're thinking about inclusive growth, what are the barriers to full participation for women in the Americas, and what are businesses and governments doing about it? So it's about getting that sunlight and transparency and then working every day at it to make sure that we're actually living up to those agreements. So what I'd love to see come out of this and out of this year is a reinforcement of the importance of these public-private dialogues, and then making sure that we don't just let it go. Okay, what's next year's event? How are we working with these working groups? How are we leveraging the IDB and others to make sure that we're moving forward at pace? And then I do think I'll go back to what I said before, which is, we need some sort of framework for economic integration. You have the Pacific Alliance, you have a lot of these different initiatives. How do we knit them all together? And how do we make sure we're looking at where the gaps are so that we have fully inclusive growth in the region?
Thank you, Sarah. Rodrigo, over to you.
Yeah, I plus one on the having stronger and more reliable working relationship between private and public, especially in digitalization and technology. We understand that technology and disruption is hard for policymakers, but also policy and rule of law is hard for innovators and entrepreneurs. So there's a huge opportunity to come together and work together. So how does that translate? I think we can take, not reinvent the wheel. I think we have strong institutional channels, and we have, such as the ADB Financial Service Group and other working groups, that let's just strengthen them and use them more broadly, and to actually build commitment and buy-in, like we say, from all key stakeholders and agencies, so that this isn't only a diplomacy event every couple of years, but it's more a continuous work that has an accountability aspect to it when they come back to our region and actually implement policies. So I think, and Alejandro has experience in this, the IMF, the BIS, they are very good at elaborating this broader commitment and task force that include, for for example, peer reviews or other mechanisms that really make it so that there is a responsibility and accountability to actually execute, measure, and develop concrete policy outcomes from the summit. No, so that is something that needs to happen during this year agenda. No?
Thank you for that, Rodrigo. Stephen, you did mention in your remarks the need for a health summit to be taken and be organized on a yearly basis. So what would that look like in your mind? And how do we ensure that we set ourselves accountable and those that we're trying to also support as leading up to the summit?
Maybe in a lead up to an answer, just a couple of thoughts. I mean, on the America's Business Dialogue side, I think we've been very smart in terms of the metrics, the SMART, and specific and measurable, and in particular, we took great effort not to start over from scratch for the recommendations going into this summit, but really looking at those from 2018 and building upon them with a greater focus on actionable projects. So not just a rehashing and stuck in this Groundhog's Day of reviewing and rewording the same recommendations, but we really did have progress. And so we do expect the ABD to issue the latest batch of those on which we've been working for a while, and those will be fed into the government. And also the ABD has a pretty good job. They've got a dashboard on not just activities, but a number of metrics and looking at what's been done and what's not been done. I'd say if you look back at the last summit, the one observation we had, and we also kind of look at what you have in the form of APEC, and APEC has had the time to mature. I'm not sure, given geopolitics, what it is today, that we could even recreate APEC today, much less an APEC of the Americas, but we've kind of been playing the hand we've been dealt. And so instead of the annual leaders meeting, we have the triennial summit of the leaders. Instead of the ABAC, we've got the America's Business Dialogue. And instead of a trade-focused secretariat, we've got the bank, the IDB, and their excellent partners. But it's really not the same having a bank which is at the end of the day making loans and making money. And they're not really, they've got implicit policies, but they're not really policy setting. So one of the requests that we in the ABD had 3 years ago to the bank and their key role on the SURGE, the Summit Implementation Group, was to really try to bring some coherence between the leaders, the summit and the leaders' aspirations, the lending provisions of the bank itself and all the implicit policies that go in, and all of the recommendations coming from the America's Business Dialogue. And I would say the bank is very good at convening, any given month, they're convening the trade ministers, the health ministers, you name it, in Washington or elsewhere in the region. And I would say 3 years ago, 4 years ago, there wasn't a tremendous amount of coherence to that. And they've taken great strides. So for example, when you're having the governments convene in Los Angeles, there's a much more focused effort now and a coordinated effort. It's not just a random assembly of random ministers, but you've got trade ministers focused on good regulatory practices. And they've done a very good job at bringing greater coherence and tying that to the summit. Now, there isn't a formal trade track to this summit, but nonetheless, the work that the trade ministers are doing, we think will be aligned with the work of the ABD. And we would continue to, provocatively encourage the bank to maybe make a more formalized effort within their project review and their approved lending, so that it very much has to tie to either summit proposals or ABD recommendations and a combination thereof.
Thank you, Stephen. Alejandro, I would like to turn it over to you if you have any questions for our panelists or any final remarks. We're getting close to the end of the session, and I just want to make sure to give you also a chance to give a word if you wish.
No, thanks. I think, there were many excellent ideas and topics. I think the issue on digitalization and not walking back on the things we learned during the pandemic and make them permanent, I think it's an excellent point. Secondly, I think, hopefully the summit will assess what the region needs to be better prepared for the next pandemic, and how we should be much better coordinated to distribute equipment, vaccines, treatments, etc., and be ready to identify the problems and be ready to deal with the problems in a better way. Third, I think the issues of equalizing regulation and trying to move to more regional regulatory standards should be key. And I think an issue that we didn't discuss today that might deserve another seminar is the issue of climate change, and how the region can basically balance this worldwide need to fight this great threat to the world, at the same time that as developing and emerging markets need to really address very urgent social needs, all of that with very scarce resources. No, so how can we put together a regional agenda that addresses the regional concerns at the same time that the region makes its contribution to this world quest to fight climate change? So look, I take out many very interesting things, and the issue would be how to engage policymakers to really move forward fast in coordinating with the private sector to address some of these issues. So just thank all the panelists, because I think we have an important list of things that we can think about and hopefully will be addressed during the summit.
Thank you, Alejandro. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Carolina and to the entire team at the Americas Institute for providing this platform for dialogue, for engaging and addressing not only the challenges, but the opportunities that the hemisphere is facing, and being able to make sure that we take the most advantage of what we have and think creatively of what can be done. And we want to make sure that the Institute serves as that platform for the private sector, for the public sector, for civil society, for academia to come together, engage in discussion that will then lead to impact. So thank you to Georgetown University. Thank you, Alejandro, and the team. And thank you, of course, to our panelists for being part of this. And we wish you luck leading up to June, and hopefully also to the team that will be traveling there. And we hope that this was a fruitful discussion, and thank you again for participating and everybody that tuned in. Have a great day. Thank you, everybody.